Hello there, welcome to the Saraway channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I hope you're doing incredibly well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And I hope you're keeping yourself free from getting any flu bugs and stuff like that, keeping your immune system strong and healthy. I'm definitely doing that because it makes a big difference, because you need to protect yourself from colds and flu at this time of the year. So before we get started with our lovely story tonight, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. Where are you going, love? My mother asked me, as she saw me heading straight for the front door with Lassie, my golden retriever, devotedly at my side. Lassie was wagging her blonde tail furiously and letting out a few excited yaps. I was a bolshy 14-year-old teenager at the time, and felt distinctly peeved that my mother couldn't see where I was going. Was it not blindingly obvious? Did I actually have to spell it out to her? Was she really that dumb? I'm taking Lassie for a walk, I said, in an indignant, almost inaudible mumble. I wish you would speak up, love, my mother complained. Why are you always mumbling under your breath, so that I can hardly hear you? You're taking Lassie for a walk at this time of the day, are you? She said, looking affronted, her face crinkling up into a big frown. Jack, it's 5:10, for goodness sake. Why did you not take Lassie out earlier, after you returned home from school? You know how I feel about you leaving the house at this time of day. I made a face at my mother and answered somewhat testily. I had tons of homework to do, Mum. I wanted to get my homework done first, before I took Lassie out for her walk. I was waylaid, because I had so much homework to do. It took longer than I bargained for it to take. Mrs. Smith made us write an essay called The Picnic. I couldn't think what to write about. I hated when she makes us write fictional stories. It's a struggle to know what to write about. And it's not allowed to be a true story. Mrs. Smith is trying to encourage us to tap into our imaginations, and I just don't have one. Oh, so it's Mrs. Smith's fault, is it, Jack? Don't go putting this on your English teacher, said my mother in a contemptuous snort. You always make excuses, don't you, Jack? It's the story of your life. One excuse after another, if you ask me. You're just like your father in that way. You're one of the worst procrastinators known to man, always putting everything off until the very last minute, just like taking Lassie for a walk. How many times have I told you, Jack dear, that I want you to take Lassie for a walk when you return home from school, after you've eaten your sandwich and drunk your juice, of course. When you've given her a walk, then you can worry about your homework afterwards. That's how we've always done things around here. I don't like you going out at this time of the day when the traffic will pick up as people return home from work. And there are many more cars out on the road there, which isn't a good idea when you're walking a dog. Besides anything else, I like you children to be at home at 5 o'clock, not wandering off to do your own thing as you will. Me and your father like your lives to be run on some kind of manageable, regimental, well-structured schedule. And never have you once taken Lassie out at this late time of day before. And this can't happen again, Jack. Have I made myself absolutely clear? But, Mum, Lassie hasn't had a walk yet. It's not that busy on the roads. It never really is in this neighbourhood. It's always been peaceful around here. I don't know what all the fuss is about. It's no big deal. Besides, I'm going the way of the doggy park, where many people who've returned home from work walk their dogs. Lassie's very social. She really likes meeting with other people's dogs. Mr. Lehman from number 48 has a Labradoodle called Jetski, who Lassie really, really likes. I think it would be so nice for Lassie to meet up with him again. Jetski is a beautiful dog with an amazing temperament, and Lassie really, really likes him. My mother let out a disgruntled sigh that revealed how silently outraged she really was with me. I always knew when I ruffled my mother's feathers, and this was one of those quintessential moments. So you had this all planned out, did you, Jack? for Lassie to have an amorous liaison with a labradoodle called Jetski. I know the dog well enough. I've seen him around and about, and you're right, he's a handsome specimen with a very friendly nature. I happen to know from Mr. Lehman that Jetski is unneutered. Lassie has not been done yet. The last thing I need is for us to have 8 little puppies rolling around the place. I hope you aren't harvesting any funny ideas in that head of yours, Jack. I wouldn't be surprised if you were up to something sneaky like this. I wouldn't put anything past you to come up with an idea like this, bringing those 2 dogs together for ulterior motives, so to speak. I will admit that my face betrayed my clandestine motives by flushing a bright pink colour, because my mother was absolutely on to me, whether she knew it or not. As it happens, I had talked with Mr. Lehman at great length about his labradoodle, who hadn't been neutered yet, as Mr. Lehman couldn't stand the idea of neutering his dog, but he did agree with me that mixing Lassie's DNA with his dog Jetski was a swell idea indeed. I hadn't told him, of course, that my mother would be having kittens if she had the remotest inkling about this rather disingenuous, conniving plan of mine. I knew that Lassie was definitely in season, so taking her to the doggy park was a great idea, in the serendipitous hope that me and Lassie might accidentally, on purpose of course, run into Mr. Lehman and his stunning golden labradoodle Jetski. I mean, what was the harm in tempting fate and destiny to a helping hand? I'd wholeheartedly promised Mr. Lehman, of course, that if Lassie got pregnant with Jetski's virulent sperm, that he could have first choice of one of the puppies that Lassie conceived, and he seemed very pleased with this idea. "How do your parents feel about Jetski impregnating Lassie?" he had asked me with concern in his voice. "I hope they're on board with this idea. I wouldn't want them thinking that Jetski is going around the neighbourhood, impregnating all the female dogs at will, for I wouldn't let him do that." "Oh," I said, shrugging my shoulders nonchalantly, and looking as innocent as I possibly could. "My parents think it's a great idea, Mr. Lehman. My mother's committed to the plan, provided you agree, of course. She believes the combination of the 2 breeds will bring about the most adorable, irresistible puppies that no one will be able to resist," I lied enthusiastically. Mr. Lehman continued to look pleased. He rubbed his hands together. "I was not thinking of Jetski impregnating a golden retriever, I must admit. The idea had never occurred to me, until you suggested it, of course. But there is no doubt that Lassie is a fine, splendid-looking dog, and as good-looking as mine is. And I think your mother's right. The puppies will very definitely be highly sought after. Blending their DNAs together will bring forth the most beautiful puppies you've ever seen. I want first pick of the litter, if that's all right." "But of course, Mr. Lehman," I had said. "I wouldn't have it any other way. You'll get the first choice of all of the puppies." "I'm very glad to hear it. I tell you what, young man. When Lassie here is in season, you come to the doggy park at about 5 p.m, said Mr. Lehman. "That's when I tend to get back home from work, and that's when you will find me walking my dog in the park. I'm sure it won't take a few minutes for Jetski to do the deed," he said, giving me a wink. As I was reflecting over my clandestine duplicitous motives for going to the doggy park on this occasion, my sister began to study my face rather curiously. Then she let out a rather raucous chuckle. Not the kind of noise that is very becoming for a 12-year-old girl, mind you, who tends to chuckle like a rooster, like my sister so obviously does. "Look! Jack's going as red as a tomato!" she cried out with laughter. My sister Angie was wearing a big "I got you" grin on her face. "I do believe you're on to something, Mum. Jack wants Lassie to have puppies, don't you, Jack? That's why you're conveniently going to the doggy park at this time. You want to run into Jetski. We're not all idiots, you know. It's not about your homework taking up all your time today. You had this all strategically planned out, didn't you? I know what you're like." "I can't think what you're talking about," I said in my own defence, with a very straight face, my skin burning red from my lies. If I carried on like this, my nose would grow as long as Pinocchio's. My mother continued to frown. She studied me through suspicious, narrowing eyes. "Well, I hope none of this is true, Jack. and that you aren't deliberately attempting to have Lassie impregnated by Jetski. I would hope you wouldn't do something underhanded like this. The sooner I take that dog of yours to be done, the better, she snapped. The last thing we need is for Lassie to get pregnant. I couldn't stand for any of that. But you can't do that to her, Mum. I want Lassie to have lots of puppies at some point in time. I think she deserves the privilege of becoming a mother. Imagine if you hadn't been allowed to have children. How would you feel about that? Imagine if you had been forced to have the snip. I bet you wouldn't like that. My mother shook her head furiously. It's not the same, Jack, and you know it. Dogs aren't the same as people. Most people have their dogs done. It's pretty routine these days. And it's about time we attended to Lassie in that regard. You're wrong, Mum. Dogs are exactly like people. Sometimes they're a lot better than people are, because unlike people, they never ever judge you. You could smell like a dumpster, look like you've been dragged through a hedge backwards, and a dog will unconditionally love you, while people will be quick to tear you apart limb from limb, like a team of hungry coyotes. For your information, Lassie is my very best friend. I think she'd love to have a litter of puppies at some point. She'd make a fabulous mum. I don't want to discuss this matter with you any more, Jack. It's pointless to argue about something so nonsensical. And as for Jetski, make sure you keep Lassie away from him while you go on your walk. I have a horrible feeling Lassie could actually be in season, and I'm not joking either. Come to think of it, I do remember spotting some blood on your duvet the other day, and I don't want to be dealing with a litter of puppies. I don't know why on earth Mr. Lehman is so adverse to getting his dog neutered. People around here who take their dogs to the doggy park should be more responsible about getting their dogs done. I suppose I'm a fine one to talk. Anyway, you would think the vet was giving Mr. Lehman the procedure himself, not his dog. If that man allows Jetski to impregnate our Lassie, I will personally castrate him myself. See if I don't. What are some men like? You say the word castration to them, and they practically close their legs so tightly together and look mortified by the word. Just so you know, Jack, Gertie is coming to dinner tonight, as she does every Friday. She should be here at 6:30. I thought you'd help me peel some of the vegetables for supper tonight and help me lay the table. But you impulsively going to the dog park at this very inconvenient time, when I could do with your help, well, everything's been waylaid, has it not? Gertie was my mother's sister, and every Friday night, like clockwork, she came to dinner with our family. My mother's mother had died even before I was born, in a tragic horse-riding accident when my mother was only 23 years old. My mother's sister Gertie, who had never had children of her own, had become a so-called substitute grandmother figure for us in our lives, although me and my sister had never considered her to be a loving matriarch figure like that, and neither did either of us warm to her. She was the kind of person you took in very small doses. She was dictatorially opinionated about things, and could sometimes be downright rude, as if she had absolutely no filter to tether her emotions. I gather my mother's mother had been her intrinsic opposite in every way, the kind of very gentle soul who was careful with her words, and who would never choose to willingly cause offence, and unlike her sister Gertie, had always loved animals from horses to dogs without exception. Gertie had never understood her sister's love for animals, because she thought most animals were filthy, dirty and unhygienic at the very best of times, and made no secret of this fact. According to my mother, her own mother had been an elegant, demure woman, a woman of few words, but by contrast Gertie could garrulously talk until the cows came home. Sometimes it was almost impossible to get her to leave on a Friday night, because it was hard to shut the woman up. She was like a cuckoo clock that you couldn't switch off, try as you might. I do not know of a single Friday night dinner that Gertie had enjoyed in our home where she didn't cause some level of offence. She always bluntly remarked on my mother's cooking, which she always seemed to find fault with, and in a way I believe she enjoyed being tactlessly impolite at any given opportunity. "Oh, these potatoes, dear, are very overdone, if you don't mind my saying so," she would say, offering her own salient advice. "You need to watch them, dear. When they're in the oven and when you're roasting them, it's far more superior to always use goose fat, I find. My mother always used goose fat all the time she roasted potatoes, and it makes a world of difference to the flavour, let me tell you. I can taste the olive oil on these potatoes, dear. Far too pungent for my liking, I have to say. Another thing I'd like to point out is you don't get your potatoes fluffy enough. One of the best secrets is to go for a potato that is good for roasting, that is both waxy and starchy. You can't get better than the Yukon Gold, I find. They are the absolute best potatoes for roasting purposes. My mother would respond by saying, "Thanks for the advice, Gertie. I will bear it in mind in future." Other times Gertie might say, "You've got way too much garlic in the casserole, dear. It dominates all the subtle flavours in your dish. You must be very careful when adding garlic to a dish. I, for one, don't want to smell like the metro in Paris, where you can barely breathe because the stench of garlic is so overpowering. People there are practically sweating the stuff out of their pores in the subway, let me tell you. It is utterly revolting. And the French consider themselves the best cooks in the world. If they've got to put so much garlic into every dish, then I seriously doubt they're that good at cooking after all." It was interesting how Gertie was quick to deride my mother's meals at any given opportunity. But I noticed she was always heartily cleaning her plate, so nothing remained on it. If my mother's meals were as substandard as she steadfastly claimed, it was rather surprising she never left anything behind on her plate, which she'd have probably licked clean if no one had been watching her. Another example of Gertie's abrupt rudeness was when she told my mother to her face that she had put on a substantial amount of weight. "Why, I do believe you're getting a little tubby, dear, around the middle. And at your age, middle-aged spread is not very attractive and very hard to lose. My advice is you need to start counting calories as soon as possible. You don't want to end up like me, my dear, with an impaired metabolism like I happen to have. I have a good friend who weighs everything out that she eats. You would be wise to follow in her example. She's had a great deal of success in losing weight around her middle." It was really weird that Gertie would go on about my mother's weight, given she herself was as wide as a barrel, was rather rotund, like an oversized pork sausage that was bursting at the seams. She regularly wore flowery dresses to flatter her figure, but I somehow think the dresses made her look even more enormous. My mother should have turned around and said, "You're a fine one to talk, Gertie. Why, you must weigh half a ton." But my mother was far too polite, too diplomatic and well-mannered to ever insult Gertie, even though Gertie wasn't afraid to be as blunt as possible when it came to my mother. Another thing Gertie had a big go at my mother about was her hairstyle, telling her rather abruptly that it didn't suit her at all. "Why, you do look like a boy, my dear," she told my mother. "Why do you cut your hair so desperately short? It's most unflattering and very unfeminine on a woman. I've never understood the fixation of short hair myself. And as for all those dreadful highlights, what's wrong with your original colour? It looks as if you've been painting streaks on your hair. It's most unbecoming. Why on earth is the streaky look so in fashion? God only knows. Hair should always be one standard colour." My mother was used to Bertie's unbridled directness, but I never appreciated how uncouth the woman actually was, and the very fact that she had never liked my dog Lassie and thought all dogs should be kept outdoors made me dislike her all the more. I will say even Lassie, who liked practically all human beings on the face of the earth, wisely kept a wary distance from Gertie, who had kicked my dog 2 or 3 times with an expression of revulsion on her face. "Get that dreadful dog away from me, Jack dear," she would pipe, as if she was swatting away a filthy fly. Every time Gertie visited, Lassie would keep her distance from the woman, almost as if she knew that Gertie did not like her. If we sat together in the living room as a family, Lassie would lie in front of my feet very protectively, almost as if she was protecting me from the woman, and on several occasions I had heard her emit a very low growl at Gertie, that she had never done before to another human soul. On one occasion when Gertie was sitting alone in the living room, fumbling through a magazine, I suddenly heard the most terrifying bone-chilling scream, the likes of such I'd never heard before. It was coming from the living room, and I knew it was Gertie. I really thought in that second that she'd been attacked by an intruder who had unwittingly broken into our home. I dashed into the living room, holding a baseball bat up in the air as a defensive weapon, to attack the intruder, but I didn't find an intruder with Gertie. I realised the woman had thrown a wobbly, because she had inadvertently sat on Lassie's dog blanket that I'd accidentally failed to remove from the couch, and Gertie's green skirt had got covered in a plethora of blonde hairs. But the way she was going on about it, you'd have thought the woman needed rescuing from a burning building, as her life was in perilous jeopardy or something. "What's the matter, Gertie? You gave me such a shock. I was so scared. I thought a burglar had broken into our house and attacked you. What's happened? Are you all right?"
"All right? Do I look all right, Jack? I think not,"
said Gertie, her round face growing white with indignation, and her many turkey-like chins wobbled furiously beneath her fleshy face. Her bug eyes glared at me furiously from behind a pair of jewelled-looking glasses covered in a plethora of diamante, as Gertie, like a magpie, was fixated by anything that sparkled. She'd often carry purses covered in rhinestones around with her, or wear them on her feet in the form of sandals or shoes, and she always wore jewellery covered in diamante.
"Look at me, Jack. I'm covered in your dog's hairs," she said accusingly,
trying to shake off a few of Lassie's dog hairs off her woolly green skirt.
"Look at the state of my skirt. It's absolutely ruined thanks to that wretched dog of yours. How many times do I have to tell people like yourselves that having dogs around the house is most unclean and unsanitary? You should get rid of the nasty thing. He's like a big oversized blonde rat that needs exterminating as far as I'm concerned."
"You sat on Lassie's blanket," I explained apologetically. "I'm sorry. I should have removed it before you came to our house for dinner. I only put it on the couch to stop the dog's hairs getting onto the furniture. But it's only dog hair, Gertie. And it's on your skirt. It'll come off easily. I'll get you a clothes brush if you like. It's not a big deal. Your skirt is definitely not ruined. I promise you that."
"I disagree with you, Jack. My skirt is definitely ruined after the dog's hairs have got all over it. Honestly, that dog of yours is such a nuisance," she piped insolently. "Why you let it into your house, God only knows. And leaving flea-ridden blankets lying on your settee for your guests to sit on is nothing short of offensive and insulting. You should never have got that dreadful dog in the first place. But your constant badgering of your father for the dog finally made the poor man buckle under the pressure. You wouldn't stop going on and on about it, would you? You wanted a golden retriever, and nobody could say no to you, could they, Jack? Because you're spoilt rotten. So what did your father do? He brought you one. Your house has been soiled and contaminated by that dog's presence. I imagine even her filthy hairs are stuck in the carpets and on the furniture. And there are probably fleas laying their eggs everywhere. It's so filthy having a domestic pet on the premises. I don't know why your father ever got you that dog. More's the pity as far as I'm concerned."
"Lassie doesn't have fleas, Gertie," I said, leaping to her defence. "I wash her regularly. She's as clean as a whistle. She sometimes moults in summer because it's hot." "You're being unkind, Gertie. Lassie is a member of our family, and we love her very much. You're talking about her as if she's a dirty rat."
"You're telling me I'm being unkind, are you, Jack? Do you have any idea how ludicrously expensive the skirt of mine was? I need to be careful what I wear when I come here on a Friday evening, because it seems no place is safe for me to sit, with that bag of fleas always lying around, soiling everything in her wake with her long blonde hair."
At that point my mother had come into the living room to see what the fuss was about, because she could hear Gertie's raised voice. She instinctively leapt to Gertie's defence before I got the chance to say something rude back to my so-called substitute grandmother, as anyone who wants to offend my dog, well then I'm quite happy to deride them myself. But my mother never gave me a chance to intercede or to stand up for Lassie. Instead, she profusely apologised for the state of Gertie's skirt, ordering me to get my father's clothes brush at once. To say that I was not fond of Gertie was an understatement, and I could never comprehend why my mother was so insistent on inviting the brash woman to dinner every single Friday night. I think my father shared my clandestine opinions about the woman, but he wisely kept such thoughts to himself to avoid getting into an argument with my mother that he knew he would never ever win. I sighed at the dreadful thought of having Gertie for dinner again on Friday, as Friday had rolled around yet again, and for 5 hours I undoubtedly would have to put up with that insufferable, very hostile woman all over again, hurling insults at Lassie left, right and centre, like a flurry of darts being flung indiscriminately at a dartboard. No doubt Gertie would be telling us how awful my dog was, and how I should drop her off at the nearest shelter. I couldn't understand why she failed to appreciate how beautiful Lassie was, as everybody else so obviously did. Indeed, when people visited our home, all they could do was marvel at the gentle manner of my dog, and how physically beautiful she was, with her long flowing blonde hair. But Gertie could see nothing good in Lassie at all. As I was about to leave the house with Lassie at my side, my mother was still going on at me like a nagging fishwife about how she'd like me to help her prepare vegetables for the evening meal that Gertie would soon be attending. I sheepishly said to my mother, "Why can't Angie help you peel the potatoes and set the table tonight? I'm always the one that does the chores around here. You never ever ask Angie to help you out. Why do you always pick on me to do all the chores? When did Angie ever help with anything?" Angie was my 12-year-old sister, who always seemed to get away with doing nothing for as long as possible. Well, as long as I'd known her to be my sister, that is. I suspect it had something to do with being the youngest, and in my experience the younger sibling can get away with blue murder. Even my best friend Colin, who lived a couple of doors down from me, in a similar-looking house to ours, was in exactly the same position as I was, as his younger sister got away with even more than Angie actually did. So suppose I could have had a worse deal, but I did think my situation was rather piteous, to say the very least. It just wasn't fair that I always ended up doing the lion's share of all the household chores, or getting into trouble if something went wrong. It would seem as the oldest kid in my family, I was always the one at fault. One time Angie had scraped her brand new bicycle while out cycling in the neighbourhood with me. On this occasion she'd lost her balance, and her bicycle went skidding across the tarmac. My sister was subsequently ejected off her bicycle. Luckily she was unharmed, and the street was very quiet at the time. She only received a graze on her knee, but her brand new bicycle took a beating, with some of the glossy paintwork being badly scratched off its surfaces. Somehow the damage to her bicycle ended up being all my fault. My mother blamed me, proclaiming I should have been watching out for my sister more carefully. I would be told, "You know, Jack, that your sister Angie is ungainly and cack-handed on that bicycle of hers. You should have been paying closer attention to her, so she didn't fall off the bike. You need to look out for your sister, Jack. Not everyone is as nimble and coordinated as you so obviously are. You must remember Angie is still learning to use her brand new bicycle. And as her brother, I expect you to watch out for her." So yes, you could say my annoying sister Angie got away with everything. And much as I loved her, there were times I felt frustrated that in my parents' very biased eyes, my mother most especially, Angie could invariably do no wrong, as if she was the one born with a silver spoon in her mouth, which I rather suspect she was. On this unassuming Friday afternoon, Angie was sitting at the breakfast nook in the kitchen doing her homework. She had a glass of Coca-Cola on one side of her, and a small plate containing a couple of chocolate chip cookies that she hadn't touched yet. We always liked to finish our homework on a Friday, so that we could enjoy the weekend together as a family, without thinking about assignments that were required to be handed in first thing on a Monday morning by our ever-so-demanding teachers, that seemed to take great delight in piling on homework for us to do on the weekends. As you can imagine, all this homework would invariably frustrate me, as the teachers at our school for some reason never seemed to believe we deserved a break from being lumbered with yet more work. I always did my homework upstairs in my bedroom, against a background of jazz music, which my mother tirelessly complained about, saying it disrupted the peaceful tranquillity in our home. But I liked listening to it. It helped me focus, and I think that Lassie liked it too, as she'd always drift off into a peaceful slumber, lying against my legs, as I dutifully attended to my homework. My mother always diligently supervised Angie's homework. She knew that Angie could get so easily distracted and completely lose focus, and then her homework would never ever get done. So my mother had taken it upon herself to keep a vigilant watch over Angie until her homework was finally complete, rather like a hawk overseeing a meaty carcass. When Angie first started doing her homework in her own bedroom upstairs, my mother would find her listening to the radio, reading one of her many novels, and losing all track of time. After that, my mother put her foot down and decided Angie needed to be supervised at all times, or her grades would go into a rapid decline. My mother always believed that it was important to supervise your children, and if they failed in their grades, it was almost the parents' responsibility, because they played a part in that failure. Angie was scribbling furiously in her exercise book, chewing the end of her pen. I had sneakily suspected that she had long since completed her homework, but was trying to look as if she was still busily engaged in trying to figure out a very difficult math equation. Let's not kid, for my sister Angie, the nauseating, unappealing idea of doing any chores around and about the house was something that filled her with the utmost of dread. She was intrinsically lazy by nature, and much preferred the easier life. Over the years she had become cunningly masterful at pulling the wool over my mother's eyes, so invariably she got exactly what she wanted from her. Angie looked up at me from her exercise book. She took a sip of Coca-Cola from the long-stemmed glass filled with ice cubes that rattled as she lifted it to her mouth. I noticed she was wearing exactly the same exasperated frown as my mother had on her face, and it suddenly struck me like a lightning bolt how incredibly alike my mother she actually was. I had never really realized this before. I had seen photographs of my mother of a similar age to what Angie was now. In this private moment I reflected on those photographs of my mother at a similar age to Angie. If the truth be told, my sister looked like the carbon copy of my mother. They rarely were two birds of a feather. They looked so alike. Despite their age differences, both had similar olive complexions, identical brown chestnut-coloured hair, although in my mother's case her hair was heavily highlighted with auburn blonde and chocolate-coloured hues, but it was always kept meticulously short in a sophisticated avant-garde style, which Gertie so obviously professed to hate. And maybe for that quintessential reason alone, just to ruffle up Gertie's feathers, which my mother probably secretly enjoyed doing, she had rigorously stuck to the same hairstyle. Angie's hair was long and silky, almost always worn away from her face in a no-nonsense ponytail. Both my mother and sister had similar-coloured hazel eyes that were dappled with green flecks. Angie sat up erect on the seat. Her back became as straight as a pencil. She fiddled with the elastic band in her hair to realign her ponytail that had swung too far to the right. It was clear by her disapproving, somewhat defensive demeanour that she was not happy with me for suggesting that she should help my mother prepare the vegetables for the evening meal. "I can't help, Jack," she said, pulling a face that made her suddenly look like a really ugly gargoyle. I couldn't help but think. "I'm busy, can't you see? I've got all this math homework to figure out. I'm swamped by all this homework of mine that Mrs. Cloyson gave me. The woman is such a slave driver, let me tell you. You have no idea what she's like. I'll be lucky if I get through it all." My sister let out a heavily exaggerated poor me kind of sigh that didn't fool me for a single second. She brazenly continued, "Knowing my luck, there'll still be homework left to do. Tomorrow morning," she said with a sorrowful tone to her voice, as if she was one of those people that had life incredibly hard. My sister's big act did not deceive me for a single second. She was a natural-born actress, and I could smell her deceit on her as fragrantly as a cadaver dog can smell a dead corpse. To affirm my suspicions, I could see a mischievous, rather smug glimmer in my sister's eyes, and I knew at once she was lying through her teeth about all the homework she needed to complete. But my mother fell for her artful shenanigans hook, line and sinker like she did every single time, and it naturally drove me stark raving mad. But somehow I managed to hold my tongue, as rubbing my mother up the wrong way would do me no favours. She would always take my sister's side in any dispute, it would seem. My mother frowned at me. "You heard your sister, Jack. Can you not see she's terribly busy with her homework at the moment? She hasn't got time to help me prepare the vegetables for dinner. I was relying on your help, Jack. But I guess Lassie needs a walk more than I need you to peel the potatoes for supper. Given you failed to walk her earlier on in the morning. Be quick about it, will you? I don't want this happening again."
When you return home from school, that is when you're expected to walk Lassie, Jack. Not at this late hour of the afternoon, under the pretence you had so much homework to complete. I'm inclined to think that it wasn't the essay that was keeping you. You probably knew Gertie was coming to dinner tonight, as she does every Friday. And I suspect you wanted to escape the inevitable chores like peeling the potatoes. I wouldn't put anything past you, Jack, said my mother, waving a formidable finger at me. Just so you know, I'll keep the chores for you when you get back. You'll be doing the potatoes when you return from your walk. You're not getting away with it. I promise you, Mum, next time I'll walk Lassie directly after school and leave my homework for later. And don't worry, I'll do the vegetables for you when I get back. Good, I'm glad to hear it, Jack.
So there we are, we've reached the end of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.